There's a dangerous detail about irritation that almost no one notices. It rarely arrives shouting. It arrives whispering, a snide comment, an unexpected delay, a seemingly small gesture of disrespect. And when you realize it, your mind is no longer yours. It has been taken over. Let me explain what just happened, because this is profound. Whenever someone manages to steal your peace, that person takes control of the situation. It doesn't matter if it was in traffic, at home, at work, or on social media. Irritation is the clearest sign that you've surrendered the reins of your mind to something external. The Stoics realized this centuries ago. And the most unsettling thing is that they arrived at a simple and brutal conclusion. Nobody irritates us. We allow ourselves to be irritated. Now here's where it gets impactful. Most people spend their entire lives trying to change the behavior of others in order to finally find peace. The Stoics did the opposite. They shielded their minds so that nothing from the outside could steal their serenity. You'll be shocked when you understand that irritation isn't a problem of temperament, but of interpretation. There's a Stoic principle that, when truly understood, completely changes how you react to people. Pay close attention to what happens next. Epictetus, who knew humiliation, injustice, and loss like few others, stated something that should be repeated every day. It is not events that disturb men, but the judgments they make about them. Wait, that changes everything. If the judgment is yours, then the power is yours too. But here's what you need to understand. Between stimulus and reaction, there is a space. And it is in that space that freedom resides. Most people live on autopilot. They react before thinking. They respond before understanding. They explode and then try to justify it. The Stoics trained in exactly the opposite way. Discovery 1. The first major defense against irritation begins in the body, not the mind. Before any rational thought, the body reacts. The heart races, the muscles contract, breathing becomes short. And if you don't notice this, the mind simply follows the body. Let me explain what this means. Those who cannot control their own bodies in moments of tension will hardly control their own minds. That's why the Stoics practice conscious pausing. Breathing before responding is not weakness, it's strategy. Imagine a common scene. Someone provokes you. A sarcastic comment, a veiled insult. The immediate impulse is to retaliate in kind. But according to the Stoics, that impulse isn't you. It's merely a conditioned reflex. Wait a moment and observe this. When you take a deep breath, slow down your body and don't react immediately, you break the cycle. The other person expects conflict. You offer silence, and silence, when born from self-control, disarms more than any sharp response. Now you might be thinking, if I don't react, I'll seem weak. Valid point, but here's what makes it different. For the Stoic, strength isn't noise. Strength is inner mastery. It's remaining whole when everything tries to break you apart. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is not to become like the one who offended you. Consider the depth of that. When you explode, you don't win. You become the same. And by becoming the same, you lose the advantage. Irritation is an emotional trap. It promises immediate relief, but exacts a high price later. Guilt, exhaustion, regret, and loss of energy. The Stoics understood something the modern world has forgotten. Energy is a precious resource. Wasting it on insults, pointless arguments, and provocations impoverishes one's own life. But are we willing to accept that most of our irritations stem from unrealistic expectations about other people's behavior? Because, as this idea begins to take hold, something uncomfortable arises, the realization that it's not the other person who needs to change first. It's how you interpret, react to, and position yourself in relation to the other person. And it's precisely at this point that the next discovery begins to take shape. when the focus shifts from external provocation to the silent management of one's own mind. When the focus shifts from external provocation to internal management, something begins to become clear. Irritation cannot sustain itself. It needs fuel. And that fuel is almost always the expectation we create about how people should act. Let me explain what just happened, because it's revealing. Whenever you get annoyed with someone, there's a silent phrase behind the annoyance. He shouldn't be like that. She shouldn't have done that. People should act differently. The Stoics realized that this expectation is a constant source of suffering. Now, this is where it gets specific. Discovery 2. The Stoics taught that we shouldn't expect the world to adapt to our ideal, but that we should adapt to the true nature of things. Marcus Aurelius wrote that upon waking, we should remember that we will encounter meddlesome, ungrateful, arrogant, and unjust people. Expect it. This isn't pessimism, it's preparation. Pay close attention. When you expect resistance, imperfection, and human failings, they cease to be emotional shocks. They become part of the scenery. And what doesn't surprise you doesn't irritate you with the same intensity. Most people suffer because they wake up expecting perfect cooperation in an imperfect world. The Stoics woke up expecting reality as it is, and that's why they were less dominated by it. Let me explain what this means in practice. If you expect everyone to be polite, fair, and conscientious, every deviation becomes a personal affront. But if you understand that each person acts according to their level of awareness, many attitudes cease to be offensive and become merely predictable. Now you might be thinking, so I should accept everything. Valid point. But here's what makes it different. Accepting is not agreeing. Accepting is not allowing the other person's flaws to destroy your inner stability. Seneca warned that we suffer more in our imagination than in reality, and observe how this manifests itself in irritation. Often, what bothers us most is not what the person did, but the dialogue we create afterward, replaying the scene in our minds, adding intentions, exaggerating meanings. Wait a moment and observe this. How many times do you relive an irritating situation over and over, even when it's already over? The event is finished, but you continue to feed the discomfort. For the Stoic, this is a waste of life. Discovery 3. There is a fundamental difference between observing and absorbing. Most people absorb everything: opinions, criticism, irony, bad moods. The Stoics trained themselves in observation without absorption. Epictetus said that if someone provokes you, it's not the provocation itself that hurts you, but the judgment you make of it. Imagine your mind as a protected space. Not every word deserves entry. Not every comment needs a response. Let me explain it simply. When someone says something unpleasant, it's just sound, a vibration in the air. The harm only happens when you assign personal meaning to it, and meaning is a choice. Silence, in this context, is not omission. It is filtering. It is consciously deciding what deserves your mental energy. Now, here's a powerful shift. When you stop reacting automatically, people begin to lose their power over you. Not because they've changed, but because you've changed how you position yourself. And this creates something curious. Many provocations exist solely to generate a reaction. When the reaction doesn't come, the game loses its meaning. But have you ever realized how many arguments in your life started because you felt the need to prove something? Discovery 4. The Stoics avoided pointless disputes like one avoids traps. Marcus Aurelius advised against engaging in debates that only inflame the ego. Before responding, he would ask himself if that answer would make him a better person. Consider this honestly. How many times have you entered an argument knowing you wouldn't change the other person's mind, but still went ahead? Not out of honesty, but out of pride. Irritation grows when the ego takes over. When you constantly feel the need to be right, you become vulnerable. Any disagreement becomes an attack. Any criticism becomes a threat. The Stoic forgoes empty victory to preserve true peace. And here's an uncomfortable point. Often, silence is the strongest choice. Not because you don't know the answer, but because you know it's not worth it. As these ideas begin to fall into place, something profoundly changes. Irritation ceases to be seen as something caused by others and begins to be perceived as an internal sign of misalignment. And now, an inevitable question arises, not to be answered aloud, but with inner honesty. In what type of situation do you most easily find yourself losing your temper? Traffic, family, work, or social media? When you identify the environments and situations in which you most often lose your temper, you begin to see a pattern. And the Stoics were obsessed with patterns because they knew that what is repeated can be trained. Let me explain what just happened, because this is crucial. Irritation doesn't arise out of nowhere. It follows predictable paths, always the same triggers, the same people, the same circumstances, and everything that is predictable can be prepared for. Now, this is where it gets deep. Discovery 5. The Stoics didn't try to eliminate emotions, they trained their responses. There's a huge difference between feeling and being dominated by them. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that feeling the impulse of anger is human, but acting on it is optional. Wait, this is liberating. You don't need to blame yourself for feeling irritated. The problem isn't the emotion arising, but the invitation you give it to linger. Let me explain this practically. When irritation arises, it knocks on the door of your mind. You can acknowledge it without letting it take hold. The mistake most people make is trying to forcefully expel the emotion or surrendering completely to it. The Stoic does something different. He observes. Observing without reacting creates distance, and distance weakens emotion. Seneca wrote that no passion is strong enough to dominate someone who has learned to observe it calmly. When you name what you feel, anger, frustration, impatience, you cease to be the emotion and become the one who perceives it. Now you might be thinking, this seems difficult in the heat of the moment. Valid point. But here's what makes it possible. The Stoics trained before battle. They practiced negative visualization. They mentally anticipated difficult situations. They imagined criticism, delays, losses, disrespect. Not to suffer, but to avoid being surprised. Pay close attention to this. When something deeply irritates you, it's almost always because you weren't expecting it. Surprise amplifies emotion. Preparation neutralizes it. Discovery 6. Another silent pillar of Stoicism is the mastery of the body as a gateway to the mastery of the mind. Epictetus taught that before attempting to control thoughts, one must control visible reactions. Wait a moment and observe this. Tense shoulders, clenched jaw, fists. These physical signs fuel irritation. If the body is at war, the mind will follow suit. Let me explain what this means. When you consciously relax your body in response to a provocation, you send a direct message to the nervous system. The threat is not real. There is no immediate danger. Deep breathing, open posture, slowing down movements. This isn't modern technique. It's ancient wisdom. Most people try to calm themselves by thinking. The Stoics started with the body, and the body, when calmed, pulls the mind along. Now, here's a subtle but powerful shift. When you master your own body in stressful situations, you begin to emit something that people feel. Presence, steadfastness, self-control. And interestingly, the more self-control you demonstrate, the fewer provocations arise, not because the world has become kinder, but because you've stopped being an easy target. But have you ever noticed how some environments seem to drain your energy more than others? Discovery 7. The Stoics were rigorous about what they allowed to remain around them. Environments, conversations, and relationships that constantly generated imbalance were seen as risks to inner peace. Epictetus warned that we should not continually expose ourselves to that which weakens the soul. This does not mean fleeing from the world, but wisely choosing where to invest our presence. Observe honestly. There are places where you always leave more irritated than when you arrived. People who always bring out the worst in you. Insisting on this is not a virtue. It's self-neglect. Stepping away when possible is an act of emotional intelligence, not cowardice. And here's an important point. The Stoic doesn't walk away with hatred or resentment. He walks away with clarity, without drama, without needing to justify himself, simply preserving what he considers essential. As these practices begin to integrate, something slowly transforms. Irritation becomes less frequent, not because the world has changed, but because you've changed the internal environment where it used to thrive. And it is precisely at this point that an even deeper understanding emerges. The ultimate root of irritation lies not only in situations or people, but in the invisible attachment we create to things, opinions, and expectations. When we talk about invisible attachment, we touch on one of the most delicate points of Stoicism, because attachment rarely presents itself as weakness. It usually disguises itself as control, excessive care, a need for recognition, or a desire for everything to go according to plan. Let me explain what just happened, because this is essential. Whenever something external has absolute power over your mood, there is attachment. Attachment to the opinions of others, attachment to the image you've built, attachment to the idea that people should act in a certain way. Now this is where the transformation happens. Discovery 8. The Stoics understood that emotional suffering stems from the desire to control that which was never under our control. Epictetus was direct in stating that whoever tries to govern what is external ends up becoming a slave to frustration. Wait a moment and observe this honestly. How many times do you get angry not because of what happened, but because it got out of your control? A delay, a cold response, a mistake from someone you didn't expect. The anger, in this case, doesn't come from the event itself, but from the broken expectation. Let me explain what this means in practice. When you accept that you don't control people, outcomes, or circumstances, you stop fighting against reality. And when the fight ends, the irritation loses its power. Seneca taught that desiring things to happen as they should is the path to serenity. This is not conformity, it is alignment with reality. Now you might be thinking, but if I don't care, I'll become indifferent. Valid point. But here's what makes it different. Stoic detachment doesn't eliminate care. It eliminates emotional dependence. You continue to do your best. You continue to act with integrity, but stop making your peace contingent on the final outcome. Discovery 9. Another point the Stoics mastered was attention to what is essential. Most irritations arise from small things that are given exaggerated importance, a tone of voice, a slow cue, an irrelevant comment. Pay close attention. When you get irritated by something small, it's not the event itself that's big. It's the energy you're giving to it. Epictetus warned that happiness depends on knowing where to place your attention. When you pay attention to the trivial grows. When you prioritize the essential, the rest loses importance. Let me explain this clearly. Before reacting, the Stoic would ask himself if it would have real importance in a few days or years. Most of the time, the answer was no. And if it doesn't matter in the long run, it doesn't deserve to steal your peace of mind now. This simple question acts as a powerful filter. It reduces conflict, it saves energy, it preserves focus. Now, here's something that few people actually do. Discovery 10. The Stoics cultivated rational empathy. Not an emotional empathy that absorbs the pain of others, but a lucid understanding of the human condition. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded us that people act driven by ignorance, fear, or inner suffering. Wait, that changes the perspective. When someone acts rudely, unfairly, or aggressively, it says more about their inner state than about you. Let me explain the impact of this. When you see the other person's limitations, anger gives way to understanding, not because the action was correct, but because you don't need to be affected by it. This empathy doesn't justify abuse. It simply prevents you from carrying a burden that isn't yours. Notice how liberating this is. You become less reactive, less defensive, more centered. As detachment, attention to what is essential, and rational empathy take hold, irritation begins to seem strange, almost out of place. It no longer finds fertile ground to grow. And it is precisely here that a silent yet powerful realization emerges. The peace you seek does not depend on the silence of the world, but on your ability to maintain inner order even amidst the noise. And when that order is established, a discrete strength begins to emerge, the strength of someone who no longer needs to prove anything, react to everything, or wear themselves out over anything. When that subtle strength begins to emerge, something changes in how you position yourself in the world. It's not arrogance, it's not coldness, it's stability. And stability is a rare thing in an environment where almost everyone lives reacting. Let me explain what just happened because it's revealing. The less you react, the more clarity you gain. And the more clarity you have, the less room there is for irritation. The mind ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a point of observation. The Stoics understood that true freedom lies not in doing whatever one wants, but in not being forced to react to everything. Now this is where it gets deep. Discovery 11. The Stoics practiced daily self-examination. At the end of the day, Seneca advised mentally reviewing one's actions. Where did I lose my temper? Where did I react unnecessarily? Where could I have acted better? Wait a moment. That wasn't fault, it was training. Those who don't review, repeat. Those who review, improve. Let me explain the impact of this. When you analyze your reactions without judging yourself, you begin to notice patterns. Certain people, certain times, certain physical states, hunger, tiredness, overstimulation. Irritation is often a symptom, not the cause. By recognizing this, you begin to act before the trigger, not after the explosion. You sleep better, you eat better, you reduce unnecessary stimuli, you conserve energy. Discovery 12. Another essential point of Stoicism is the understanding of impermanence. Nothing remains the same. People change, situations pass, emotions arise and disappear. Pay close attention. When you get angry, it seems like it will last forever. But it doesn't. The emotion is fleeting. The problem is that the reaction leaves lasting scars. Epictetus reminded us that we must endure and renounce. Endure what is beyond our control. Renounce the desire to control the uncontrollable. Let me explain this simply. When you accept that everything is transient, you stop dramatizing. Life goes on. The comment is forgotten. The conflict dissolves. This awareness reduces emotional intensity. Now, a silent but powerful change is emerging. When you don't cling to emotions, they pass more quickly. Irritation comes, but it finds nowhere to stay. Discovery 13. The Stoics deeply valued silence, not as an absence of speech, but as a presence of discernment. To speak less, react less, explain less. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, reminding himself that it wasn't necessary to comment on everything, answer everything, or correct everyone. Consider this honestly. How many conflicts have you avoided simply by remaining silent? How many more would you have avoided if you had chosen not to respond? Conscious silence is not escape. It is selection. You get to choose your battles, and the fewer battles you choose, the fewer wounds you have to heal. But have you ever noticed how deeply connected the need to speak, respond, and justify oneself is to the ego? Discovery 14. The ego is one of the greatest allies of irritation. It craves recognition. It wants validation. It wants to win. When the ego rules, any disagreement becomes a threat. The Stoics trained themselves to weaken the ego, not by placing themselves above others, but by freeing themselves from the constant need for approval. Let me explain this clearly. When you don't need to prove anything, nobody can easily provoke you. The insult loses its target. You become less defensive, more serene, more whole. As the ego loses strength, irritation loses its main fuel, and something curious happens. You begin to respond firmly without aggression, with clarity without hostility. And it is precisely at this point that tranquility ceases to be merely the absence of anger and transforms into the presence of inner strength, a strength that begins to guide your choices, your words, and even your silences. When that inner strength begins to guide your choices, something reorganizes itself within. You no longer act to alleviate momentary emotions, but to preserve something greater: clarity, coherence, self-mastery. Let me explain what just happened, because this is crucial. Irritation fades when you begin to see yourself as responsible for your state of mind, not guilty. Responsible. This change is subtle, but it transforms everything. The Stoics didn't ask, "Who irritated me?" They asked, "Why did I allow it to affect me?" Now this is where it gets deep. Discovery 15. The Stoics understood life as constant training. There were no neutral days. You either strengthened your character or weakened it. Every reaction was a training opportunity. Wait a moment and observe this. When someone provokes you, it's not just an annoyance, it's an exercise, a chance to practice what you say you value. If you react with rage, you have trained yourself to be angry. If you react calmly, you have trained yourself to be calm. Character is shaped by repetition. Let me explain the impact of this. When you start to see provocations as training, irritation changes its meaning. It ceases to be a threat and becomes a test. And tests don't require anger. They require preparation. Discovery 16. Another central principle of Stoicism is to act according to virtue, regardless of the behavior of others. Marcus Aurelius reminded us that the error of another does not justify our own. Pay close attention. Many people use the rudeness of others as an excuse to lose control. The Stoic does the opposite. He asks himself, "What is the response most aligned with who I want to be?" This question changes everything. Let me explain. When your actions are guided by values and not by impulses, you don't regret them later. Even if the other person remains wrong, you remain true to your character. And integrity breeds peace. Discovery 17. The Stoics were clearly aware of finitude. Life is short. Time is limited. Epictetus reminded us that wasting time on anger is wasting life. Wait and observe this seriously. How many hours of your life have already been consumed by pointless irritations, arguments that led nowhere, held grudges, repetitive thoughts? When you remember how brief life is, irritation starts to seem like too expensive a luxury. Let me explain the effect of this. Awareness of finitude creates priorities. You become better at choosing where to invest your emotional energy. Discovery 18. The Stoics also practiced detachment from identity. They did not define themselves by positions, opinions, or external images. This made them less vulnerable to personal attacks. Observe honestly, when someone criticizes something you confuse with who you are, the pain is greater. But when you separate identity from opinion, the criticism loses its power. You are not your opinion. You are not your status. You are not your image. You are your ability to choose how to act. This detachment protects the mind. As these principles take root, irritation becomes increasingly rare. Not because the world has become kinder, but because you have become more grounded. And at this point, something important needs to be understood. The absence of irritation does not mean the absence of firmness. On the contrary, it is precisely calmness that allows one to act with precision when it really matters. When calmness allows for precise action, a distinction emerges that few understand. Serenity is not submission. Self-control is not passivity. The Stoic is not someone who accepts everything, but someone who chooses when to act and when not to act. Let me explain what just happened, because this is crucial. Most people confuse irritation with strength. They believe that raising their voice, instilling fear, or reacting aggressively is a sign of power. The Stoics saw the exact opposite. Whoever loses control has already lost their position. Now this is where it becomes clear. Discovery 19. The Stoics knew how to set boundaries without excessive emotion. They didn't need to shout to be firm. Firmness came from clarity. When you know what you accept and what you don't accept, there's no need for an outburst. Pay close attention to this. Many irritations arise because boundaries weren't established beforehand. Accumulation generates tension. Tension explodes. The Stoic cuts it off first, calmly, objectively. Let me explain this in practice. Saying no at the beginning avoids resentment later. Communicating clearly prevents prolonged conflicts. Silent boundaries offer more protection than emotional confrontations. Discovery 20. Another essential point is the responsibility for one's own words. Marcus Aurelius reminded us that words have weight. Once spoken, they cannot be taken back. Wait a moment and consider this. How many times have you regretted not what you felt, but what you said when you were angry? Impulsive speech creates damage that fleeting emotion doesn't justify. The Stoic chooses words like one chooses tools, carefully, purposefully. Let me explain the impact of this. When you speak less under the influence of emotion, you preserve relationships, reputation, and dignity. Silence once again emerges as an ally of clarity. Discovery 21. The Stoics also practiced accepting discomfort. They didn't run away from difficult situations just to preserve immediate pleasure. They knew that avoiding all discomfort strengthens emotional fragility. Look at this honestly. Some irritations arise because we don't tolerate frustration. We want constant comfort, quick answers, immediate recognition. The Stoic accepts discomfort without rebelling against it. Let me explain. When you calmly endure small frustrations, you become more resilient. And the more resilient you are, the fewer things irritate you. Discovery 22. Another powerful principle is the consistency between thought and action. Irritation increases when you act against what you believe. When you say you value calmness, but react with fury. When you say you value respect, but respond with aggression. This inconsistency generates internal conflict. The Stoic seeks to align speech, intention, and action, and this alignment reduces the internal tension that often manifests as irritation directed at others. Wait and see. Often you're not angry with the other person, you're angry with yourself. As this coherence strengthens, the mind becomes more stable. Less internal noise, less need to unload emotions on others. And then something curious happens. The people around you start reacting differently, not because you're demanding it, but because your attitude changes the atmosphere. Conscious calmness commands respect effortlessly, and when you reach that point, you begin to realize that irritation was never the main enemy. It was merely the visible symptom of a scattered mind, confused values, and misdirected energy. When this becomes organized, only one final understanding remains, perhaps the most important of all, the one that completely redefines the meaning of inner peace and strength. This final understanding emerges when everything starts to fall into place. The irritation was never the real problem. It was merely the alarm. a sign that something inside was out of order. When you try only to silence the alarm without reorganizing the inner workings, it always returns. Let me explain what just happened, because this is definitive. Peace is not the absence of external conflict. It is the presence of internal governance. And those who govern themselves are not held hostage by words, attitudes, or circumstances. The Stoics called this autarky, inner self-sufficiency, not in the sense of isolation, but in the sense of not being emotionally dependent on the world to feel good. Now, this is where everything comes to a head. True strength, according to Stoicism, is silent. It doesn't need to react to assert itself. It doesn't need to win arguments to exist. It doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Marcus Aurelius reminded us that the best way to live is to be what you expect from others. If you desire respect, be respectful. If you desire peace, be calm. If you desire order, be orderly within. Wait a moment and observe this. When you act like this, irritation completely loses its meaning, because it stems from the demand that the world change, and the Stoic has already understood that the world will not change on demand. What can change is how you position yourself in relation to it. Peace, then, ceases to be something you seek and becomes something you practice, daily, in small gestures, in restrained responses, in chosen silences, in firm yet calm boundaries. And here it's important to be clear. This doesn't mean you'll never feel anger, discomfort, or frustration. The Stoics never promised that. They taught something more realistic and more powerful. You don't have to be ruled by these emotions. To feel is human. To be dominated is optional. When you understand this, irritation loses its authority. It appears, but it doesn't take control. It tries to take over, but it encounters a trained, conscious, and stable mind. And that is why Stoic peace is not fragile. It does not depend on good days, polite people, or favorable circumstances. It endures even in noise, chaos, and provocation. Whether this path represents a fully attainable ideal or a lifelong continuous training is of little importance. What matters is that anyone who wishes to live with greater clarity, dignity, and inner strength needs to observe, practice, and prepare themselves. Observe your own reactions honestly. To pray, in the philosophical sense, is to reflect deeply on who you are becoming with each choice, and to prepare yourself daily to act consciously in a world that constantly tries to pull you into autopilot. Because in the end, those who master themselves are not controlled by anyone. And true freedom makes no noise. It manifests itself in calm, clarity, and inner strength.